Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, February 16th, 2024. DC and IRS Doubletalk. Ordinary Americans don't believe you. The IRS says tax enforcement pays for itself and then some. That's the title of an article in the Wall Street Journal on February 6, 2024, which documents the attempts by the IRS to justify keeping the $80 billion appropriated to it by Congress. The article states, in 2022's Inflation Reduction Act, with no Republican votes, Congress gave the IRS nearly $80 billion to spend over a decade. Most of the money went to enforcement, but some of it was dedicated to improving the agency's outdated technology and expanding taxpayer service. The idea was to reverse a decade of declining audit rates and focus enforcement on corporations and high-income households. The Internal Revenue Service boosted its estimates of its own value, projecting that Congress's recent expansion of the agency will generate $561 billion in tax revenue. That's higher than early Biden administration forecasts. The updated figures from the IRS and the Treasury Department reflect new research on how audits can deter tax cheating for many years. The agencies now project that the average return on investment for enforcement spending is about $6 for every $1 spent instead of the original $5 for every dollar. And they now include the effect of modernized technology that should help the IRS detect tax dodging and encourage voluntary compliance by making the system smoother. This report from the IRS said that continued funding would bring the total revenue collections to $851 billion through 2034. Now, does anyone believe that the IRS is doing the right thing? In the February 8, 2024 Unleash Prosperity Hotline, Steve Moore, one of our Americans for Fair Taxation Advisory Board members, shared information about the percentage of people who trust the federal government to do the right thing. Do you trust the government to do the right thing most of the time? The Wall Street Journal published a chart yesterday showing that only 16% of Americans trust the government's competence. That's the lowest percentage who have trusted the government in 6 decades. Now contrast that result with our CTUP poll of cultural elites and Ivy League graduates. We found that 70% of elites trust the government to do the right thing most of the time, and an even more astounding 89% of Ivy League super elites do. In conclusion, Americans agree that everyone should pay their fair share of federal income taxes to fund our government. They agree that it's unfair for people to cheat and to make the rest of us pay their share of federal tax obligations. If you're going to keep the present corrupt income payroll tax system, the estimated 20% of tax filers who engage in illegal evasion need to be audited and made to pay their federal taxes. Unfortunately, tax cheaters don't self-identify. In fact, they work hard to appear legitimate and hide the fact that they're cheating. Now, only the brain-dead bureaucrats in D.C. justify catching the cheaters by having the IRS harass the 80% of us who do our best to meet our tax obligations honestly. It's time to scrap the income payroll tax system and replace it with a system that doesn't rely on tax returns and doesn't need an all-powerful federal agency to administer and enforce it. Since the real solution, replacing the present system, makes so much sense, why do the D.C. bureaucrats cling so tightly to the income payroll tax system? Well, the answer to that is linked to the survey cited above. While only 16% of Americans trust the government to do the right thing, 70% of elites trust the government to do the right thing most of the time, and again, an even more astounding 89% of Ivy League super elites do. Now, the Biden administration is composed mostly of elites and super elites. Now, the elites want to use the power of the government to give them control over every aspect of our lives. To them, harassing the 80% of honest taxpayers is perfectly logical and justified because the IRS may collect $851 billion in the next 10 years. That's more than 10 times the $80 billion that's been allocated to the IRS. However, they ignore the fact that former IRS commissioner says that $1 trillion a year is being evaded. So, even if this stepped-up enforcement brings in the full $851 billion over 10 years, that would reduce illegal evasion by less than 10%. Now, the elites are fine with this massive expansion of the IRS because it accomplishes two of their most sacred objectives, increasing the size and power of the federal bureaucracy and creating more government jobs. It's time to say to D.C., eliminate all of this nutty thinking and adopt the FAIRtax. More importantly, why are we going to tolerate further invasions of our personal privacy just to allow D.C. to prop up a corrupt and broken income payroll tax system when adopting the FAIRtax will eliminate the IRS and will eliminate the need to file any personal income tax returns? The FAIRtax will be border adjustable and bring well-paying jobs back to the U.S. It'll grow the economy much faster than the income payroll tax system. It will permanently fund Social Security and Medicare, and the FAIRtax will eliminate the regressive payroll taxes and replace it with a progressive national retail sales tax, thanks to the prebate. And finally, the FAIRtax will transfer power from D.C. to the people. We, not the bureaucrats in D.C., will determine how much federal tax we pay. There are many more reasons for moving from the income payroll tax system to a consumption tax like the FAIRtax. You can go to FAIRtax.org and see the economic studies there, or just start looking at past chairman's report at the advantages outlined in those articles. However, perhaps the main reason is that the FAIRtax shows the true cost of government on every receipt. It's time that our rulers in D.C. are honest with us about what their mismanagement is actually costing us. Now, we're adults. We deserve to know just how bad the cancer is so we can face it and fix it before it's too late. Now, if your member of Congress refuses to support the FAIRtax because of some perceived flaw or shortcoming, remind them that legislation can be amended. Don't let them get away with condemning the entire bill because it has a flaw that can be easily addressed, and don't think for an instant that there aren't any flaws in the income tax. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Please stand with us and demand that your representatives support a much fairer, much simpler, and much more efficient way to fund the government, the FAIRtax. The FAIRtax doesn't pick winners and losers. Because it taxes spending, not earnings, the FAIRtax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. The FAIRtax collects the revenue the federal government needs to operate, but does it in a way that has the least adverse impact on our individual freedom and the least impact on our economic prosperity. With the FAIRtax, there are no tax returns to file, no records to keep. We pay our federal taxes when we make retail purchases of new goods and services. And with the FAIRtax, there's no need for the IRS. If you sell a used couch or a used jet ski online, there's no FAIRtax due on that transaction. The FAIRtax will allow us to take back control. The income payroll tax system is broken. It's no longer working. We can't repair it, but we can replace it with the FAIRtax. Join us and take back control of our country and our lives, not with bullets, but with the elimination of one of the biggest threats to our liberty and economic prosperity, the income payroll tax. Is it hopeless? When confronted with a seemingly impossible problem, remember the statement attributed to the author George Bernard Shaw. He wrote, "You see things and you say, why? But I dream things that never were, and I say, why not?" Isn't it time for us to ask, why not? Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing or investing $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for Fair Taxation. Now, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to FAIRtax.org and invest in AFFT. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the FAIRtax and learn why the FAIRtax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.